Trevor Tunnacliffe is a composer and multi-instrumentalist from Vancouver, Canada. His musical interests draw mostly from the early Renaissance counterpoint treatises, which he first encountered as a viola da gamba player. He currently plays bass, guitar, and modular synthesizer for Unthunk, his collective project whose music ranges between chamber and pop, including a mix of vocal and instrumental pieces. My name is Giovanni and this is Let's Talk Music with Frap Tools. Thank you very much, Trevor, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
I usually start by asking our guests what their musical journey has been, so I'd be curious to hear yours as well. How did you start playing music, and how did you end up with the modular synthesizer as your instrument?
So I grew up in a small town in the interior of British Columbia, Canada, where culture was not a primary focus. It was a town of loggers and miners. So in my town, there was no music program in the school. My family was sort of musical adjacent, let's say, in that my grandfather played church organ, and my great-grandfather was a fiddler in a dance band. But my dad was a mechanic. He didn't really do too much of music, but because of those influences of my progeny, what are the opposite of progeny? My ancestors.
The ancestors.
I saw my grandfather, playing the organ all day when he was retired, and that was a good feeling for me to see this is what people do with their life. In this small town, there was a cello player who made her living teaching piano to kids. We didn't have a piano. My neighbor had a trumpet, so I started on the trumpet until she said, "Well, your lips are too big to play the trumpet. What else?" And I said, "Bass guitar, that'll work for me. I want to be like a pop musician or whatever." So I got to play a bass guitar, and she taught me how the strings worked. And in high school, no music program, but I played bass in a Dixieland band with the teachers. That got me into music, I guess you could say. I picked up the recorder when I was timber cruising, which is the way you measure trees for getting cut down. This is my job after high school. Fiddled around with it a little bit, and that led me to an interest in early music, to a degree in early music performance practice, at which time I switched to the viola da gamba. And somehow along the way, I decided that my grandfather, my great-grandfather were musicians. I want to be a musician too. And it wasn't too long before I realized that making a living in early music requires some special skills, which I didn't really have. So I decided that I got to make a living. In fact, I had some help from my wife who says, I worked at it for a while. The thing about being a musician and making a living at it, I realized is that you can do it, but what you end up doing may be further from your ideal than what you really want. So the living in music was teaching kids how to play the recorder and the piano. Although I was a terrible piano player, I had enough skills from going to music school that I could teach kids. Bow marking at the symphony, and in my ensembles that I played in, which was my real love, we ended up playing parties and weddings and such like that, the kind of music that people wanted to hear. Bach, Vivaldi, Telemann, that kind of stuff, which was not really what I was interested in. So making a switch to say, don't make a living at that, just do what you want for pleasure, seems like was a happy turning point in my life, to just let go of the trying to make a living at it, doing it. And when I made that decision, it was very helpful, figured out how to make a living. And then that freed me up to say, what do I really want to do? And composer sort of feeling was what I most felt skilled and happy doing. And the composer thing was allowed me to do the early music stuff that I really liked, which is modal counterpoint, but with modern instruments and aesthetics, which is always a bit of a funny thing. When you're playing music from the early Renaissance, which was my period, there's a big gap in what a human's, like a person in that role is a courtier. You're under the thumb of your prince, and you're very highly mannered. You're wearing these very elegant costumes, and you're always on parade and always performing, not just the music, but the court life. And like, I can't relate to that. Like, here we are, we're wearing our plaid shirts. I'm still a bit of a lumberjack, and so even though I love the modal counterpoint, the musical aesthetic, the cultural aesthetic was really weird. So being able to say, I'm going to do modal counterpoint, but with a lumberjack shirt on, so that it can be, the words are about modern things, the aesthetics are more related to the music that I hear out on the street. So that's kind of got me turned around from the purist of trying to make a living as a early music performance specialist. And that's where the Unthunk comes from. I was basically writing my pieces and then performing them in the recording context. Because part of the thing about going to music school is you kind of realize being a musician means you got to actually deliver some music. And although there's not really any audience that I know of, and I'm not really wanting to put my effort into promoting and finding an audience, that's part of that thing about making a living is, okay, so you want to make a living at music and you're going to be a performer. Feels like you spend half your time drumming up an audience and booking gigs and all that sort of stuff. Free from doing that, I can just play out into the void and be happy doing the part that I like, which is writing the music. And I still feel like there's a need to put it out there, so I have to write my pieces and then record them. Started out with having my friends and associates to be kind of session musicians to perform. I just basically paid the bass and got everyone else to do the other parts. But over time, I felt like I can do more and stepped up my guitar playing to the level that I was as a gamba player and thought I need to do something else. So first I was thinking I should play the English horn because that's kind of like a recorder, but more flexible, modern, sophisticated. And then I thought maybe I'll play the French horn or E-flat trumpet, which is kind of like a trumpet shaped, but larger, the size of an E-flat horn that you play up here like a tuba. And then I thought, you got to spend a lot of time practicing to do that. And I really want to spend my time recording. And I got the idea about playing the synthesizer. I thought, you can make it do whatever you want. So you can make a sound like an English horn. You can make a sound like a French horn and such like that. So that's how I got into the synthesizer, is as a way to complete the recordings that I had written.
Wow, that's a fascinating way to approach the synthesizer. A very practical one.
Very practical,
I dare say. Yeah. But I love the fact that when you mentioned the courtly manners of the early counterpoint masters, the fact that this brought me on sort of I think it was a video that I saw a few times ago. It was like a music producer arguing about music not paying what it used to pay back in the days right now. So how difficult it is to make a living out of music. And he said, well, I don't think that the problem is that music now pays less than 2 decades ago, but the problem is that 2 decades ago it paid an enormous amount of money, like completely disproportionate, because he said that historically music has been around since the dawn of civilization, and even the highest musicians of the classical times, they were all doing side jobs, either teaching choir kids, or they were just almost kind of servants of a prince or like a ruling figure who appointed them to a certain job or gave them certain prizes. But the struggle has always been that real, even among the masters, the greatest masters of Western music. So, I mean, it's okay if nowadays we choose to go. We are probably even closer to them at this point, where music is no longer bound to a manufacturing process with a lot of revenues for many people's making records, distributing records, selling records, and we are probably getting closer to that way of making music now than it was in the past half century, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, instead of going from door to door, from fiefdom to fiefdom, banging and saying, "I'll sing for my supper," you bang on the door of the internet.
Yeah, something like that. So, and what brought you to the modular synthesizer? Because many people who approach the synthesizer with the goal of emulating, I won't say recreating, but emulating the acoustic instruments, the real instruments, often end up with either samplers or workstations or digital synthesizers that already put you, let's say, halfway through this kind of sound design process. And my question is, why did you choose to start from such a long distance?
Well, the short answer is ignorance. I sort of said, okay, synthesizer is the thing, but there are so many kinds of synthesizers. And I guess I told you, like, you asked me a question, I had to give you, like, I got to get into this story sometime. So I kind of like bundled together some bunch of half-truths to give you where I ended up talking. Mm-hmm. And then the next thing is now so I got there. Synthesizer is a good choice. What kind of synthesizer? Even by the time I got to that point, which is 5 years ago or something like that, I had kind of changed, added to what I thought I wanted to do with the synthesizer, not just play a sound like a French horn, but I had a vision of a chamber ensemble in a box that I could compose for and have it render the kind of music that I like to write and have it do the performance. So no longer was it like a monosynth. It was something that could do some more things that I could write in it as basically what you say, make sequences and multi-track sequences, and then there you have your modal polyphony. So I envisioned it also as being something that could be like a music box, let's say, but also do those other things. And so I'm thinking, well, how do you do that? I saw some, let's say, not semi-modular, but programmable polyphonic synthesizers whose names I no longer remember, but kind of did the whole thing like that. And then I thought, well, they're not really good for doing, playing a keyboard hand and to write that part. And in that exploration, the modular kind of came to the possibility of being able to build an instrument every time you want to do something different. So I guess that was the choice, is the flexibility, and Eurorack being the most prevalent and affordable, felt like, okay, I know enough now that I'm going to jump in and see what happens. And now I use it for drone type pieces, which are, I don't know, you think about your hurdy-gurdy or your bagpipes or something like that, that kind of thing has some, not so much polyphonic, but refers back to historical music, if you think of more medieval, that sort of thing. It is also good for, like, I'm not a good keyboard player, as I say, I can teach kids, but, I can use a touch controller to do that French horn melody. I can do the music box thing. I can do percussion track, like I work with the drummer still, but some pieces I will say, let's do some sort of percussion thing, and it becomes the drum kit. And all manner of things in between that. Sometimes it'll just be an effect that is doing some sort of rhythmic thing that kind of provides a background in a certain section of a otherwise performed by real instruments piece. And so the flexibility that kind of made me tip over the edge and invest in it has kind of provided more fruit than I expected.
I was curious about your modal counterpoint style as you described it. Would you like to tell us more about it, and maybe what are your influences in that style?
Okay, so the influences would be then the Renaissance masters and those, how do you say, pedagogues from that era. When I was had my purist hat on, I wanted to do early music performance. One of the things that one learned when you're in that field is that unlike later on, I say in the classical repertoire where you are a dancing monkey, highly trained performer, you're more of a jack of all trades. And one of those things was the ability to improvise, ability to write counterpoint, because like you said, you're a slave to your prince or the church that you've invested in. So you got to do whatever you're told. And so I studied the 16th century masters in terms of how to write counterpoint. So that would be my primary influence. And I guess one of the things that comes out of that are the kind of exercises you write are to be able to write the very strict voice leading that has a sense of weaving together a linear level. You're writing melodies that need to mesh very closely with the adjacent parts that are being played at the same time. So it's unlike, I guess, well, it's somewhat like a Bach chorale, but even more linear and less harmonic. So that interests me as a exercise.
Would you like to give some names to the listeners who are not familiar with the Renaissance music? Are we talking, for example, about Lasso and Palestrina, or even earlier?
A generation earlier. So I mean, yes, those guys, and there were more treatises. Geez, can I come up with Buddy's name? I think it's Serlino wrote a treatise on counterpoint from the generation before De Lasso. But the music that I really like, I think you could think of Dufay, Ockeghem, Banchouet. Those were people, Ockeghem, at the end of the 15th century that were writing music that was less imitative than De Lasso, Palestrina, and those kind of things. Also a little more free. The codification of the rules kind of narrowed down the melodic range that was considered acceptable that they wrote in the book. So you could do a leap downward of a sixth, for instance, whereas Palestrina would never do that. So a little more free in the melody and a little less cohesive from amongst the various parts. So if you look at Dufay is pretty popular. You can find some of his stuff on the internet there. Okay, so those would be influences as well. Those excellent composers would be the style that I got to hear. And I don't really say, how can I sound like Dufay unless I'm really doing something like one of my side gigs is to write music for a Shakespeare troupe here. And sometimes they'll say, okay, this is being set in the medieval era, so I will try and do something that sounds like Machaut, say. But most of the time, those influences are really under the skin rather than intentional.
Mm-hmm. I see.
I wanted to insert just a little thing when we talk about the influences. Those pedagogues, one of the things that they make you do are counterpoint exercises like writing canons. And this comes back into the module to be recommended kind of thing. So I thought I'd better just stick this in here. That they make you write these canons. So you got to be able to write a canon at the unison, like a round, or canon at a different interval. So one voice is playing a fifth above the other, that sort of thing. You ought to have to write a canon in inversion or a canon in retrograde, which, Bach does some of those stuff. And one of the things that Bach hardly ever does is a mensural canon. And to me, that was the ultimate. So if I'm influenced by my pedagogues, is how do you write a mensural canon? And Ockeghem writes some excellent ones. And I have struggled with that over the years in my modal counterpoint working. So a mensural canon is one whereby one voice is playing at a different time as the other.
Ah, I see. You can perhaps hear something in some fugues by Bach, where the theme is stretched and plays like half time and so on, but it's more kind of like a limited effect rather than just the structural foundation of the whole piece, right?
Exactly. So yeah, so he will write his theme in augmentation and diminution, which is a mensural canon effect. But to write a whole piece where that is a rule is a kind of a different level of rigor, let's say.
Yeah, I love how when you start playing with canons, there are there is a very thin edge between the musical composition, and then it is just almost like a sort of mathematical games almost, because sometimes you have to make the whole equation output the correct result. I remember that a very crazy exercise that my former teacher gave me to do. It was like I'm doing it instead of Sudoku schemes, because it was more of a game rather than an actual pleasant effect. It was playing writing a canon, like a 2 or 3 voice canon, and then once you were halfway through, or like when you finished just like 16 bars, you had to flip the page and put the keys at the end, and then start from the beginning and play a sort of a mirror. But for example, if you were playing I don't know, a high D on the alto clef, it would have become a B in the bass clef, because you had to play it upside down. And but this was more of a 19th century practice. I think it was like a Schoenberg exercise or something like that.
Yeah, and there's a good through line. I mean, we left some of that behind. I think those people, I don't know if I can remember a name, say Beethoven, probably did those exercises, but they kind of bubbled under because they were not part of the what actually was being produced. Beethoven wrote some fugues, I think. But by the time you get to Schoenberg, it's kind of turned around again, where that sort of intellectual rigor was coming more to the fore. It's more of a classical approach to composition, maybe.
Yeah, but I like it because I think that even if it doesn't have an immediate practical outcome, I think it's a very good exercise to learn how to find the patterns and how to find bonds between different notes. I don't know how to put that, but how to connections between notes and different parts of the song. So even if you don't really put into practice all those skills and all those techniques, the way you start thinking, it's kind of rewarding in any kind of music you will eventually make.
Just pass on the one of the ones that was an exercise similar to that was probably the furthest edge of an exercise was to be able to write a 2-part canon that would work both in direct, inversion, and retrograde. So the same canon, you'd write one part, and the other parts, you could make the second part do either of those things and it would still work. So it's similar to the one that you described as turn the page upside down and go backwards. And I agree, that's not music. It's very hard to make it music, but to be able to just free yourself up to have the instincts to be able to say, I'm writing now real music, and be able to find the notes and trust that they will work in the further down the road or in the other parts as they come out. It's actually like doing gymnastics or something like that to be able to go and do a sport.
Yeah, exactly. The gymnastic comparison is excellent. And you briefly mentioned your Unthunk project. So if you want, it would be nice to hear more about it and its releases over time, and if you also have other side projects or if you use that label to output all your music.
First of all, it was just me playing bass and having friends and associates to fill out those parts, and gradually became more adept at adding different playing. From a compositional point of view, one of the things that was an evolution was to go more, from writing individual pieces to writing more broader releases so that the several pieces are connected, like you're talking about a concept album, let's say, or exploring a technical exercise. One of the ones I did called Utter was very much pushing the limits of this modal counterpoint to be able to do things. There's a mensural canon in there. There's tonal relationships and rhythmic relationships amongst the whole, not a whole album. I just do as much as I can stand and then fill up the rest with filler. There was one where I tried to put myself in another character. It was a song about, or it was an album about a suicide cult where the protagonist is in the employ of a suicide cult leader, and his job is to write the music and become the sort of minister of propaganda. So it's a set of pieces that are all like how to pull people into a suicide cult. There's a few concept album-y kind of stuff. So I've kind of using the platform to, extend myself as a musician. Like I'm not just pumping out the music, but I'm trying to self-actualize as I'm doing it.
It only takes a minuscule snake bite to turn the key, unwind your mortal coil. We are made of stars, now let us reunite.
Few works are quite different from one another, also from a stylistic point of view. And we will be listening through some snippets throughout this episode, edited in. And you spoke about some concept albums. I think that this is a proper moment to cue your patch, the patch that you made for us, in and edit in the episode, because that patch, as we will listen, also builds and starts from a very specific and very clear concept. So we will listen to your patch and meet again in a few minutes to discuss it.
Here's the patch I want to share with you. It is a simple drone type piece, a stylistic representation of the open ocean swell, which consists of 3 independent subswell, each with its own period, amplitude, and direction. The basics are, we have a clock which drives the Usta sequencer, and each of the 3 tracks goes through the sequencer and has its own stage length. So each subswell has its own independent length, and so I can, to find the right speed, I can make the whole set of subswell go faster or slower through the clock, and then I can change the proportion of the subswell to each other by changing the stage length of each track. So track 1, right now I've got it set to use 4 different notes with a stage length of 9. Track 2, alto range, 3 different notes of a stage length of 13. And the bass, just a single note with a stage length of 15. And so that sets the period of the subswell, and each goes through its own oscillator to give the tones: soprano, alto, bass. And then with the amplitude, I'm using digital envelopes here because I've got enough of them to do the job, and the output is controlled within the envelope itself, so I can give the soprano a smaller amplitude, alto a little bit bigger, and the bass even bigger, to keep a kind of proportion with the period and amplitude kind of in proportion. The shape is sort of a sine shape for each of them, kind of roughly have the same shape. So that's, we've got the speed, period, and the amplitude, and then the direction. How I'm controlling the direction is with 2 of them are getting panned, soprano and alto, and the bass one just stays in the middle to give a sense of each coming from a different direction. So the soprano one, I have, well, actually for both soprano and alto, I have synced LFO with the envelopes, and it's a ramp shape. The first track has a 3-2-1 reversing the ramp, so it's a ramp down, and that goes into channel 1 of the QSC to give a pan from right to left, whereas the second, which is in actually channel 2, is a rising ramp, and so it pans from left to right, each subswell as it goes through, whereas the bass one just stays in the middle, and that to me represents separate directions, as if I'm standing on the west coast of Canada looking straight out to, say, Japan, and the bass swell is coming straight at us. It's the primary swell, the largest one and the longest one. And there's also one soprano coming down from Alaska, and an alto one coming this way up from Hawaii. So that's the period, amplitude, and direction of the 3 subswell. So let's hear a little bit of those sounds together. First the soprano. Now the alto. And then the bass. So you might have noticed that those are not just simple sine or triangle shapes that each subswell is producing, but I've added some tonal interest. And the first one I'll talk about is each oscillator goes through a low pass gate. These two going through this one. This third oscillator is going through its own low pass gate and then out into the mix. And what that does for me is create a brightening as the sound increases in volume, which enhances for me the feeling of the waves coming closer and landing on the shore and then trailing off or expiring and receding. And then the second thing I will talk about is with the idea of a timeline. A timeline for me is a voltage curve that runs the full length of the piece, and it is helpful if I'm looking to create a composed piece with a well-defined beginning, middle, and end, and then that voltage can capture that shape that I'm trying to get and then modulate the various components using wherever the voltage is at the point along the piece. And for this, the voltage curve is generated by the sum of the three pseudo-sine wave shapes of the subswell summed up. And you can see that summed shape here. Sometimes the subswell are canceling each other out because they're out of phase, and then when they get into phase, the voltage gets steeper and higher. And my intention for the piece is to capture the move from the voltages being out of phase to coming into sync and reaching a peak. And how I'm using that for the tone is by taking a copy of that voltage curve and introducing just a bit of wave folding to oscillator 1, soprano, and oscillator 2, alto, using a different wave folding tool control there, so that there's a slight difference distinguishing the two. And the third oscillator, I am applying a little bit of change to the filter drive to give a similar sort of evolution to sound over time. And then the third one, what I'm doing is trying to make a subswell shape that has a more colorful back half of the curve than the front. So I'm using a frequency modulation introduced to the second half of the envelope shape. Would have liked to use phalanstry for this. If I had lots of phalanstries, I would have used the end of, I used the envelope to make the main envelope shape, and then at end of rise I would have triggered another envelope to introduce the frequency modulation, but because I'm shy of modules there, I'm using the digital ones for the main envelope, and then for the frequency modulation I'm coming back to my synced LFO that I used for the panning. And I'm also getting sine waves out of that, which happens to be negative in the first half and then goes to the positive. So in a kind of hacked way, I'm getting voltage from the second half of the envelope shape into the frequency modulation for the soprano and the alto. While for the third one, I'm using the same technique, the sine LFO, to add a little bit of filter sweep so that the filter opens up for the second half of the bass subswell. There's one more aspect to the patch I'd like to share, and that is to give the effect that I enjoy when actually watching the real ocean. The various subswell, when out of phase with each other, can present nice quiet ocean, and then when the subswell come into sync with each other, can create a set of larger waves that have some drama to them. They can stand up extra tall to the point where you can see the light through them, so they have a dramatic color. They can crash down and foam and create a little bit of drama. A few waves will go by like that, and then things will settle back down as the subswell goes out of phase with each other. So I'm doing that by calling on the timeline, and when the summed voltage gets to a certain height, I'm using a compare function. When it reaches a height, then that will trigger 3 different things. One of them is a sort of baritone pitch using Falistry as a poor man oscillator, just to set a fixed pitch there, which I can hear. It comes out with the bass sound. So there's the bass, and then if I trigger that low note, it's overlapping with the bass note there. And then the second thing that happens when the compare function trips is it will take the 2 high pitches that are the frequency modulation pitches. Those are summed together and also output, which we can hear here. Sort of like foam or the hissing of the wave as after it has gone by. And then finally, I've got a percussion module making a thumping sound like the crashing wave. Like that. So those are the 3 things that happen once the timeline reaches that critical height. Those 3 sounds come off together, creating a little bit of drama to justify sitting there around doing nothing but watching the waves.
So I think that the first thing that I would like to discuss with you is the idea of timeline that you brought in during your patch. And the first thing that I want to ask is, how often do you use this concept, and if you apply it in the same fashion on different pieces, like summing all the CVs?
Sure. So it's I don't use it all the time, but it is very often. One of the problems that I have with the music box version of the synthesizer when it just plays the music is it's hard to make it feel human or as interesting as a human does with all its little imperfections and such like that. So I think, well, if I was a good synthesist, I would be twiddling knobs to kind of make those little adjustments to kind of shape the piece. And that's where the idea of a timeline came from, is like, I can twiddle this knob, I can twiddle that knob, but it's, I'm afraid that if I turn the knob, it's going to come out like too much or too little, and I'll mar the performance of what the music box is doing. So want to kind of program that. And in some pieces, like, let's see if I can remember, Alto Stratus, the one that I did in my last release, where it doesn't have a timeline, but what I've done is I've used my fingers to trigger the very, very slow, almost a modal piece, but by putting my fingers on it and having those fingers control the amount of various CV things, it's basically that becomes the timeline that I'm doing by hand. And so the idea of having a controller to say, push more here, relax here, and then that, the Tim Davies thing where he says, have only a few modulation sources and have them do several things. I think I got to that kind of place with the timeline. I only used one timeline at a time, but it is a way to coordinate the modulations that happen. And when I can sort of think about it more in the compositional mode than in the performance mode, you kind of take back that, how you would push and pull if you were performing, to kind of program that shape. So that's where the timeline comes from. And if I am doing something where I am just performing a line like the French horn thing, I don't have a timeline for that because I will have the CV control on the amount of pressure or positioning on my touch controller that performs like a timeline. So I feel like, not any time, but almost all the time, you want to have some ability to give and take, and not just have it being a static like a actual music box. You just go ding 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 ding, which is completely static. Some ebb and flow is I can't live without that, or at least when I listen back to it. So it's either through the fingers, or there will be some timeline here, or there'll be some sort of operation that will kind of give some shape to the piece.
Yeah, if I got it right, you are putting you are summing all the modulations, all the envelopes coming from the chaos module, and they are synced with the different sequences. I mean, they happen on every stage, but the stage have different lengths. So did you actually work that out? I mean, did you calculate it when the two highest tides would happen?
No, very much the opposite of that. It's like with that patch, which is meant to be a representation of my very happy feeling of, like, one of the things I think the most valuable use a person could spend of their day is to sit and watch the tide go in and out. It takes all day to happen. Nothing happens, but 6 hours later, you'd say the whole surface of the beach has transformed from one to another. It's very slow movement, and it's not calculated, but it is the result of the moon and the earth pulling. So on a smaller scale, to me, that this was a kind of way to say that these are these ocean swells that kind of interact, and based on their own purpose, not by, there's no God making this happen or anything like that, but they will sort of come together and make these peaks. What, if you're a surfer, you call it like a set's come in. Suddenly the swells are getting bigger and they're working, but it's like you can't anticipate it, you can't plan it. They just, when it happens. So when I make this patch, I have these envelopes working out of the sequence. And when I was building the sequence, I had it in Usta, as you mentioned, or as you know from listening to what we inserted earlier on in the thing. Sometimes I'd have a 3-note sequence in this track and a 2-note sequence in that, and just kind of play around. What's the pitches? What's the duration? What's the time relation? Until it felt good. And what feeling good means is, when do those kind of come together to make the peak? So it's kind of a consequence of just noodling around and finding a sort of a comfortable relationship that then results in a peak at a reasonable length of time and such. So the timeline is really just a kind of a consequence of fiddling around with a sequence.
I see, because the two highest peaks happen at very specific and very dramatic and evocative moments. So I was curious if your calculation on the different metric structures were set up explicitly to have those happening at the time or not. And the fact that this wasn't the case, it makes it even more surprising and even more beautiful, in my opinion, because it's just like setting a biome or an environment that just grows by itself, and the output isn't. You know it's going to be good, but you don't know what kind of good it's going to be.
True. Yeah, that's it.
When I first heard about timeline, I imagined a sort of guideline with a beginning and an end, but it seems, at least from the past that we heard, that it is more of a sort of a constant framework, sort of like an underwater current that provides a sort of structural and firmness in terms of modulation. But the piece could go on like for hours so it's not saying this is where it is supposed to end, right?
It's true, and in fact, I think that's a characteristic of electronic music. I think, especially the what do you call it, chamber ensemble in a box, music box kind of thing, that things do want to repeat. You write a sequence, It doesn't just go start and end, it just keeps on going. So as much as a timeline from one point of view could be an envelope, if I had a way of creating an envelope that was 10 minutes long, that had a nice, beautiful shape, and when we get to like, what kind of module would you like built? That sort of thing is pretty cool, because then it would have a real start and end. But like for some of the pieces that I've done using Usta, using song mode, you got a 10-minute piece, but even in song mode, it just starts again. So the process I think I'm often using with the synth is to write the piece, and it runs, but it will keep on repeating. So you go away and have dinner and come back and there's on again. But because I'm mostly I had a dream. Another reason why I got into modular synthesizer is because I think one day I'm going to be too old to play the guitar, but I can still go to the old folks' home and be the musician there by like pressing the button. And like my fingers don't work anymore, but I'm a 90-year-old musician still playing. So I do have way down the road a vision of being a synth performer in that sort of way when I'm too decrepit to do what I'm doing now. But anyway, so from a recording point of view, I do the thing and then intend to snip out a judicious part of it. So the patch that I sent to you is, 2 minutes worth or whatever like that. That was kind of a nice piece, but before I broke the patch down, I did a full recording of I don't remember what it was, 8 or 11 minutes or something like that before the thing cycles through, and ended it. And I could actually edit so that it looped forever, because it does come back. But really the intention is I'm writing a piece for recording, and I'm just going to snip out a good bit and then release that. So the timeline is of at least as long a scale as the part that I intend to snip. So it is a real timeline, even though it is endless.
Would you like to talk a bit about your? Is it something that we can talk about? Your current, if there is going to be like a project where this kind of ocean patch is going to.
Sure. Right. So I first became aware of Rachel Carson because my family, we read this book to our kids that was called By the Sea by Rachel Carson, junior edition. So it had pictures of whales and described how the tides work and how the currents make the ocean to be one endless river, that kind of stuff. And it was really cool because we live close to the ocean, and that was a kind of way to be aware of the ocean together. Years and years go by, and my wife bought me for Christmas a set of the three monographs that Rachel Carson wrote about the sea, and I started reading it just after I'd finished that last project, and I kind of like tickled my fancy because I guess I have a fascination with the ocean, and decided that I'm just going to use her as the binding agent for this, call it a concept album. But anyway, I want to write about the sea. I always wanted to write about the sea. And in fact, one of those things that made me say, I'm going to do modular synth is because I've always tried to write music that reflects what I like about the ocean. I'm going to use the word love. Let's not be shy here. I love the ocean. Anyway, but, modal counterpoint, it never actually comes off in any kind of way. But I thought, the things you can do with these rhythms, like the patch that we were talking about here, it's possible to do that with a synthesizer. And so I kind of had in the back of my mind being able to make ocean music with modular synth. So now I've got a subject, Rachel Carson, American marine biologist who came to love the ocean from living in the interior, just like me, and then ended up, through her growing awareness in that study, to deeply care about the environment. And she basically founded the environmental movement. So she's like, she's got all these elements, like, we got a hit on our hands here because she's a woman, she's a feminist. She's founded the environmental movement, and she fought for rights of the animals and all this, the preserving the ocean and such like that. So it's great. and I can use her as an excuse to write music about how come I love the ocean. That's the project.
Wow, that's great. And I see on the Unthunk website that I will link in the podcast description that there are many artists involved. So I wanted to know if they are to what degree they contribute to the songwriting process.
Okay, so I'm just going to interject a little bit about the Unthunk evolution thing. I said started out just playing bass and having my friends and associates contribute. And then gradually I kind of elbowed myself out and say, I got to do more and more and more. I'm using the synthesizer instead of the French horn. The last project I felt, there's too much me in here. Like I got to go back. So in the one I'm working on, I will be having the singer, LJ, who's very versatile. Her day job, she's an actress, and so she's quite adept at playing different characters. Where you hear sometimes people will listen to it and they'll say, "Who was that?" And oh, that's LJ. She's pretending she's a little girl, which is I've asked her to do, or whatever like that. So she's a jazz singer, R&B singer. So not really my thing, but her jazz chops mean that she can play anything I give her, whether it's in 15/8 or whatever like that. It's great. So her, and I've always worked with her for the last 5 years or so, maybe even more. And Buff, the drummer, who is one of Canada's leading drummers, jazz drummers, who I get the honor to work with because he's a neighbor. Otherwise, I don't think I'd ever have his chops. But he'll be there, and he contributes to the songwriting process. Not so much like I gotta now complete the thought. I basically just write the stuff and hand out the scores, kind of thing. But Buff's role is he's basically I would call it the music director, because I will give him a MIDI version of what I've written, and then he will lay down a percussion track in those pieces that have drums, and his subtle use of time and shaping and such like that, then we just layer all the tracks on top. So we will have a detailed discussion of how this piece needs to go, how it needs to be shaped, what kind of instruments he's going to play, because he'll go everything from like those little Brazilian percussion finger instruments, what you do when you do the dancey thing, or he's got a whole raft of instruments besides the drum kit to use, and we'll work out what he's doing and then we'll put on top. So he's definitely a influence in the result. But also this time we'll be using Finn plays the cello and French horn, and I think those are the main ones. I sort of started playing the basic keyboard parts myself on my wife's Filicorda. There's a little mid-century chamber organ. Anyway, so there will be more players this time than there were before, because I feel like the contribution of the various personalities really kind of steps up the result. I've kind of felt like when I'm writing, I'm writing like a rep play. So every part that I write, even though it's modal counterpoint and they need to be sort of woven together, I try to think of each being its own character, and having actually performed by its own character is really elevates, gets the me out of it as much as possible.
I've got a technical question, but it needs a bit of an introduction, because for those who are listening or watching this episode, a bit of context. Actually, we met when we were developing the Usta sequencer, right? Because you were our scales and temperaments consultant. And so my question is, what kind of tuning or tunings do you use for the Unthunk music?
There's a gap between what I'd like to do and what I actually do. And part of that is the problem with the guitar. So if I'm using the guitar, it doesn't make any sense to do some sort of fancy temperament, because the guitar is quite angling towards equal temperament. It's hard to do some other temperament. You can do it. With the viola da gamba, it was much easier because there are the frets are made of gut, and you can sort of bend the frets and then adjust the tuning, and you can come up with a really nice quarter comma mean tone or sixth comma mean tone when you're playing the gamba. And when I had my pure early music performance hat on, we played in that kind of temperament all the time. But if I'm using guitar, it's just like, forget about it. I'll just leave it straight. But when I am working in a pure synth mode, what I tend to go for is a kind of a just intonation.
Okay.
Yeah. So 5 limit just intonation is pretty flexible for me. And I have, in my use, I have sort of 3 different ones, depending on whether it's a minor orientation or a major orientation, to kind of make sure that most of the notes are nice and clean. And I have 2 different major ones. It kind of depends on if you have anything that's, the second tone can be really messed up against the 6th tone. Like if you, that's far enough away that it can be an impure 4th. I think you need a high 2nd if you want to go with a high 6th, or a low 2nd if you go with a low 6th, depending on what the version is. But short answer would be 5 limit just intonation is what I use. In the one the patch, that's the intonation I used.
I see. Because have you just this is just like a curiosity. Have you seen those microtonal guitars that they are developing in Turkey? There is this Turkey craft, also with the Lego fretboard.
Yes, great idea. But I feel like part of the reason I just gave you this blurb, like I get to do whatever I want. It's composer hat kind of thing is my main shtick, because I'm not that good at, my finger dexterity is not that great. So for me to be able to push the fret, the string so that it goes onto those slight steps in the frets, is just too much. So I give up on the idea. That's why I said, like, there's this dissonance between, like, love the sound of a pure third, those chords where it's actually not when they're perfectly in tune, but they're so close to in tune that they just kind of float, as opposed to a third that's coming from the piano, which is kind of thing. I love that close but not quite perfectness, but the effort to get there, like, I'm just moving on.
Yeah. I know, but it's funny because you are the second Trevor named guest residing on the west coast of North America who plays with just intonation and also period instruments. So I'm seeing a trend right there.
Don't read too much into it. There might be a coincidence.
But I would like to briefly go back to the timeline topic, because I forgot to ask you a question. Okay, thank you for clarifying this topic. But now let's bring in the final question, since we hinted at it. So if you could have the chance to decide what our next module would be, what would it be and why?
Okay, so in order to answer that question, I kind of looked at what's hard for me to do, and one of them is relating to that timeline idea. So I mentioned having an envelope that would last exactly as long as a piece. So I know that you can make an envelope that would last 10 minutes or such like that. But I've been thinking of a clock that would, like, I have what is it called? Pam's workout or something like that. And it was kind of driving me crazy, the version that I had, because a lot of the things I do are in multiples of 3 rather than 4. And just because of digital technology, 4 seem to be the thing, as well as it's a very common time signature and all that kind of stuff. So it's hard to find a clock that would kind of create the right length to make a timeline. And so having that, I think it's been a bit solved with the new version of that workout clock module, but having a clock that would allow a good timeline. And add to that clock the ability to modulate the tempo ever so slightly. So this is a timeline within a timeline idea. One of the things that I find challenging about electronic music is the incessant, like, on the beatness of things. And I've talked about this, even with Simone, I kind of gripe about how can I make time modulatable. So if you had a timeline, and even if it's a specific timeline to control the tempo, where you can push the tempo forward and back ever so slightly like real musicians do, that a clock that would do that would be very handy. I would like that. So first of all, I want to be able to make a nice long timeline that has a well-controlled shape, and I'd also like to be able to modulate the tempo with that. So maybe the next Frap Tools module could have be a clock module, and if it had the clock module where you could phase shift it tempo-wise very, very nicely, that would be good. And I can bring this back to reality with, let's call it another idea. So I'm not answering your question, but if you have your product manager hat on, you can be thinking about these as like, oh, a lot of people have this problem.
No, you're answering the question perfectly, I would say.
Okay, good. So the next one is, we talked about this, you and I, before, about how do I make this thing? And you mentioned a spare track in Usta, which is really handy because of the shape that you can give it. If you just take one pattern and give it everything the right stage length and the right subdivision of the tempo, it's a good timeline maker. But what could be an addition to that? I'm envisioning an extension, or what do you call those? Like you got your module and you got a little thing on the side, extender.
Yeah, the expander.
So I'm thinking of a Usta expander that would replace the knobs, the 16 knobs around the edge, with a 16-bank slider. So you can control what happens in Usta with a bank of sliders, and that way you can bend like you can turn a whole bunch of knobs at once to create a general shape. And then, although I really like the circle with the knobs for many applications, in some applications where you want to be less precise but more intuitive, to be able to do that in the Usta would kind of help make a timeline, I think.
Yeah, because also in the Tim Davis episode, he mentioned a sort of take on the MARF by Buchla, the multiple arbitrary function generator, that had kind of the slider interface, because he said the same thing as you're saying. You say, yeah, you can do that with the Usta, but you need to put some thought on it. And if you want to go straight to the point and visualizing a sort of multi-stage envelope / sequencer, that could be good. And it's funny to know, because when we are at trade shows, when people come to our booth and see the system lights up, they tend to see the Fumana first, because it is at eye level, because it's always in the top row, and they say, okay, I don't know the brand, but I know for sure that that's the sequencer. And I have to say, well, I'm sorry, but no, the sequencer is not there. That's a spectral processor. But it kind of, seeing sliders kind of puts you into the multi-stage sequencing kind of thing.
Another one. So moving away from that's the next, like that expander thing, I think would be really handy. I don't know how to build it, so that's not my problem. I'm just saying what I want. So I would call this a canon writer. So kind of a version of a delay module. So if you have a delay module that will allow you to take the notes that are input and put them out a little bit later, and even at a different time, so you can do a kind of a mensural canon with this, and sort of the critical part of this would be long delays. So you need to be able to have not just a 2-second delay, but maybe 10 to 30 seconds or something like that would be adequate, but enough that you can go row, row, row your boat, and then this thing is going to go row, row, row your boat, as a way of creating another voice.
I am not sure that this is physically possible, because it would because with a delay it is pretty simple, because you take a sound, wait, and output it. But with this kind of mensural canon approach, you would also need to stretch the output, and which means that you will keep accumulating information, because it's getting in faster, twice as fast as it's getting out.
But okay, so I'm going way out of my depth here, but I do know that you have a looper pedal.
Yeah.
That will take a sample and can process it. And I do know that within my DAW, I can process things to go at a different tempo. So it'd be possible, in my mind, to take a sample, reprocess it to stretch the time.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. That is totally possible. But I think that this is possible when you have like a sort of a limited sample,
Exactly.
like a loop or a recorded sound on a DAW. Yeah, that's totally possible.
So there would be a start and stop control to do that thing. But even so, this module is very big and very expensive and very hard to build. It's a moon rocket kind of idea. But then, so that would be a difficult one. But if you did a looper type thing where you click on, click off, and then take it. But you could also take just a regular canon and change the interval by doing pitch shifting, which is basically, what do those things happen when you can't sing in tune, but they make auto-tune. You know, auto-tune type functions can change a pitch quite dramatically, so you could make it go up a fourth. And so you could sample in and put that thing out a fourth, and then if you could do that, why not do it in inversion or retrograde? So a canon generating module could do all those things with a very intuitive interface where you could just like say, take what I put in here, some sort of, I don't know whether it's granular synthesizer, what all those kind of processing powers that are possible with a big enough computer, and give you some output, which works, I mean, very much in line with Modal Counterpoint, which is my history, but I imagine doing things with less quantized stuff where you could create worlds that are architectural, let's say. So anyway, that was just, you asked me in your written question.
That's fascinating. It is something that I try to explore myself with the modules that I have. I think that I tried this experiment on the Make Noise Morphogene, which is basically like having a sort of tape loop, digital tape loop kind of device. And I recorded like a very simple melody consisting of mainly like fifths and seconds and fourths. I mean, those intervals that will always sound good no matter what. And then I tried to play it like 1.5 times faster, and set the tape loop 1.5 times faster, which also means that the recorded output will play a fifth higher.
Yes.
And so by playing and inputting things into that kind of tape loop, I would obtain a sort of like an augmenting canon, like every time a fifth higher. But of course, it is a sort of a tape loop, so it will deteriorate at one point, so it won't be playing always. And I assume that this is gonna, I mean, if you set it to play at 0.5, this kind of tape loop approach, you would obtain like an octave lower and 2 times slower. So that's it's kind of like, yeah, it's more of like kind of something between a looper and a tape delay, but this kind of approach, I think it's very, very interesting.
One final one, which is sort of off the map, but I have a touch control that I work with, and one of the things that I like about it is I know you were talking to one of your previous interviews, like, I hate these touch controllers, they're no good. But for me, they're fine because I can't play a keyboard anyway. So if I'm just going to be playing my notes, I can learn how to do it and they're all right beside each other. I can survive. But the touch sensitivity, for some reason, my hands are not very conductive. So if I have wet fingers, if I lick my finger and then play the touch controller, I can make these just little tickly sort of sounds. It's really cool because you can have the modulation quite intense because you're just touching one or two of the little circles and it makes a big difference. So that makes this kind of sound. But my fingers don't work well, so I want a touch controller that actually works with my fingers.
Okay. Okay. So
this is
so
off
we
the
need
edge.
to make molds of your fingers or something like that, and then do something that fits exactly like bespoke shoes or something like that.
It. That's all I got for you.
So I think that we can cap it here for today. It has been a very fascinating interview on many topics that I like and I am not very familiar with. So thank you very much, Trevor, for being with us today.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to speak with you.
So we will meet in a few seconds with my patch, with the patch that I made inspired by the one we just listened. And that's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Okay, so there are quite a few things going on in Trevor's patch that I wanted to retain in this much simplified version. And they are namely the idea of blending together all the CV going on in the patch and use this sum to trigger and to modulate certain events. The idea of playing with tuned voices with different melody length, so to create a sort of ever-changing rhythmic texture that mimics the oceans well in his patch, and the overall idea of modulating the brightness. So I played with 4 voices, just like Trevor's patch. I set the tempo much faster, and instead of using a digital envelope like him, I programmed all my tracks on the Usta sequencer to play a sequence that is twice as long as it sounds. So every note plays twice. It's very good to hear on the bass, which is on track 4. And you can see that it plays just 2 notes, C sharp and D sharp. But since the notes are split over 2 stages, I took advantage of CVB, set one stage to a high value, one stage to a low value. I set all of them to the green mode, so we are sliding between them, and I use the CVB to open and close the Brenson's wave folder. I have a alto voice here, and I wanted to change it a little bit by setting the stages to different stage length. This track is this sawtooth here going into a low pass filter on the Kunsa with 12 dB per octave and the combo mode that attenuates also the input VCA while going down. And then I have my soprano voice, which is panned slightly to the left. Same irregular pattern, but same 2 stages per note pattern, so that I can use the CVB high-low to create an irregular pattern of ascending and descending voltages. And if I play all of them together, they sound like this. And then I summed all the CVB, I duplicated them with the 333, summed with 321, and further processed with the 411. For example, I took one output straight as it is, and I used another output to modulate this CV sum by itself. And I pass the result to different destinations. For example, one copy is going to the clock divider, so that every now and then it generates a gate high signals that clocks SAPL, and the trigger output goes into the brainsource wave folder for a random ping on the bass every now and then, which sounds like this. The 2 to the nth power random clock output goes to the wave folder symmetry control, so that at every iteration of SAPL I will have a different kind of a different timbre. Another copy of these of this sum of control voltages goes into my 4th voice, which is this random arpeggio here. And I use the same signal to transpose a static sequence here on track 4, which just plays a high C sharp with the pitch shift function. And the same signal goes into this Kunsa filter cutoff, the ping input, so to have a longer decay time. A thing that I forgot about track 1 is that I set some stages with a very high variation index and a medium-low variation range, and set the following stage to slide, so to create those kind of swells, which reminds me of a very sung and very lazy way of articulating a melody. And played together with the bass, which also has some sort of upward glide effect, sounds like this. Let's add the random arpeggios. And the final channel contains a very simple copy of the melodies 1 and 2 of my alto and soprano voice, but taken from the mixed output on the Kunsa filter here, and using the band pass filters instead of the low pass that I am monitoring here. So I'm listening to a sum of the 2 band pass filters processed through Bagai's sample and hold. And so I'm having a sort of bit crashing and downsampling effect controlled by Bagai's internal fluctuating voltages, which adds some sort of vowel-like sound, also to enhance the singability of the whole track. And then I programmed a very slow LFO to open the effect send every now and then. Thank you very much for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If it's your first time listening this podcast, please feel free to check out all the previous episodes over the major streaming platforms and also on YouTube. My name is Giovanni Grandi, and this was Let's Talk Music with Frap Tools.